One second. I'd just like to start by introducing myself. My name is Kendall Marr. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Union Outreach Coordinator with Fridays for Future. So most of my job has been doing labor and union outreach throughout Toronto, attending different meetings and meeting different people within the union sphere. And then communicating with people how labor, unions, and climate justice actually intersect a lot, and how the labor movement can help build the collective power we need to achieve climate justice. And today I will be co-facilitating this teach-in on climate justice and climate labor with Nick DiCarlo. He is one of our adult allies with Fridays for Future Toronto. He's helping with the climate strike organizing, and he has worked in the union sphere for many years. So as a youth volunteer, I don't have a lot of experience in unions and labor, so he can offer some of that insight as well. Yeah, Nick, do you want to say a few words?
No, just I'm happy to be here. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Okay. So first, I just want to go over some housekeeping items. I would like to remind everyone that Fridays for Future Toronto has a very strict policy against hateful speech, including sexist, racist, ableist, homophobic, xenophobic, and transphobic comments. We have a zero tolerance for these types of comments, whether directed at our members or our supporters. Please leave the call if you're not able to interact in the discussion respectfully. And we would like to ask that if anyone has a question, you can either type it in the chat box and we will answer them as we move through the presentation, or if you'd like to ask the question out loud, just type an asterisk into the chat box, and then I can call on you and you can unmute yourself to ask the question directly. You don't have to wait till the end of the presentation to ask any questions. It's really an open teach-in discussion. So if you have any questions as we're moving through about specific slides, please just ask the questions then so we can talk about them. There'll also be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the presentation. I'd also like to say that this call is being recorded and will go on our Facebook pages. So if you're uncomfortable showing your face, you can click off your camera for the duration of the presentation. And this presentation will be focusing on climate justice and labor to illustrate the ways both spheres are intersecting and require mutual support in order to create the power we need to win. So this is an overview of our presentation. We're going to start with a land acknowledgement, talk about what the climate crisis is, have some examples, who Fridays for Future is, the intersection between labor and climate, striking for labor and labor movement action, and then the last thing is building community. So first, I'd like to acknowledge that Fridays for Future usually does land acknowledgements by highlighting Indigenous activists. So often land acknowledgements are used in a way that don't have much substance after they're said, and we like to highlight activists that are actively pushing for Indigenous justice, self-determination, in order to kind of give some substance to the land acknowledgement. So this upcoming week, the Youth for Wet'suwet'en is launching an online week of action to continue solidarity efforts with Wet'suwet'en. So Wet'suwet'en is an issue that's been all over the news recently, where the government has let a company called Coastal GasLink continue building a pipeline through unceded Indigenous territory. So unceded means there's no treaties, so this land has never been given to Canada, and the pipeline continues despite the COVID crisis. So there are many workers up on the traditional territory, and it increases the risk for individuals living there, and is very disrespectful. So I'd like to talk about Frida Hewson, and she is a spokesperson for Wet'suwet'en. She started the Unistoten Camp, which is a healing center on the land. The camp was developed to stop the trespassing by pipeline companies on their territory. And Frida has stated that for generations, the community has lost much of its land due to the farming and resource development. Herself and her community share the fear of the inevitable fact that the pipeline will also taint and poison the only available drinking water in the area, alongside destroying medicines and ecosystems on the land, therefore threatening the livelihood of their people. Quote, "Our belief is that we are part of the land. The land is not separate from us. The land sustains us. And if we don't take care of her, she won't be able to sustain us. And we as a generation of people will die. In fighting to protect the land and water and exert traditional values and priorities, the Unistoten pipeline opposition is at the forefront of a fight for all people in Canada. I shouldn't have to be dragged into the courts to prove that I own land and that I own land and I know is ours. Our people own these territories since time immemorial." So she doesn't have social media, but she is very active on Get 'em Den Checkpoint on Instagram. And there are other supporters as well that are very active, like Eve Saint, who is one of the Get 'em Den 4, and you can find them on social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram. So we're just going to go over a little bit of kind of a review of what the climate crisis is and some examples that are relevant today. So since Industrial Revolution, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has risen to levels that we have never seen in the history of human existence, and which this has led to an overall increase in greenhouse gases and the average temperature of the Earth. So Canada in particular is warming at twice the global rate. The increased temperature has led to a higher frequency and intensity of natural disasters, including floods, fires, and droughts, as well as a higher incidence of disease, mass extinction, and ecosystem collapse. On a global scale, since September, we have seen Australia's bushfires burning uncontrollably, leaving thousands of people homeless and destroying an estimated 1 billion creatures. Smoke levels over the summer months in Australia had increased to lead to severe health complications, and the long-term effects of this disaster are yet to be understood. Another example, sorry. Okay, so this is, sorry, I wasn't going through the slides properly. So this is the slide showing the greenhouse gas emissions increasing, the global average temperature, frequency of natural disasters, and this is the examples. So we were just talking about the Australian bushfires, and the other example is Indonesia on January 1st. Heavy rains brought flooding and landslides, killing dozens of people, and tens of thousands of people were displaced. And the monsoon rains and rivers submerged at least 169 neighborhoods in Jakarta. So just some examples in Canada. So during the past year alone, Canadians have seen an increase in the number of forest fires throughout British Columbia and flooding in Ontario and Quebec. So locally in Toronto, the islands required significant resources last spring to prevent extensive property damage and displacement of residents on the island due to flooding. So long-term effects of this are likely to increase, and we're likely to see the same type of flooding more frequently in Toronto, in Ontario specifically. So a little bit of what is expected to come. So NASA has said that the global climate change has already had observable effects on the environment. Glaciers have shrunk, ice on rivers and lakes is breaking up earlier, and plant and animal ranges have shifted. So trees are flowering sooner. So these are some things that they've observed. And the effects that scientists had predicted in the past would result from global warming and climate change are now occurring. So these include a loss of sea ice, accelerated sea level rise, and longer, more intense heat waves. So climate change is no longer something future generations have to worry about. The consequences are happening now. People are suffering, and we are in the last possible position to decide how we will respond to mitigate the most devastating impacts that have yet to come. Sorry. So one thing to note is that there is a tipping point to where humans will have an impact on what will happen. And the IPCC described it as an abrupt and irreversible change. So basically the tipping point is the point where we no longer have control over what will happen. So even if we drastically reduce our CO2 and our greenhouse gas emissions, we will not be able to stay below the target. So there could be warming of several degrees with associated sea level rise and rainfall changes. So the significance of passing the tipping point is that beyond the tipping point, anything is independent of human action. The forces of nature are released and have their own dynamic impact on the planet. And human action cannot stop them. So some examples are the Arctic warming feedback may render the Greenland ice sheet gone. And research predicts that the tipping point for complete ice melt can occur at a global temperature rise of less than 2 degrees, which is, we're currently on track to higher than that, so around 3 or 4 degrees of warming. And we should be shooting for 1.5 degrees in order to decrease the, mitigate the most devastating impacts. So while the full transition to an ice-free Greenland will take a few hundred years, its impacts pretty quickly would include global sea level rise of up to 20 feet in the end. So that's just one example. Another example is collapse of coral reefs, where there's a symbiotic relationship between the algae and the coral, and acidification of the ocean with while it absorbs CO2 results in coral bleaching. So just a little bit about who we are. So Fridays for Future began in August after 15-year-old Greta Thunberg sat in front of the Swedish Parliament to protest against the lack of action on climate. It became a global phenomenon, and now there are chapters around the world. So in Toronto, we are a collective of youth and adult allies who make a difference by organizing weekly and global climate strikes and marches to take on municipal, provincial, and federal government. We believe civil disobedience is essential to make a Green New Deal for Canada a reality, and we aim to mobilize people in Toronto to strike. So we have a bunch of intersectional demands that outline our climate justice issues. And we recognize that system change must include everyone, and that it's not sufficient to transition to a green economy without addressing the social inequities that often underlie climate issues. So our group has adopted these intersectional demands, which include Indigenous rights and sovereignty, defending land, water, and life, zero carbon economy, separation of oil and state, universal public service and infrastructure, and justice for migrants and refugees, and futures for all, as well as a just transition. So each of these demands are intersectional and with each other and with the climate crisis we are facing. Okay, so now into labor and climate. So the main, of particular interest, our main demand that is important to understand for climate and labor is a just transition, where we call for a publicly owned renewable energy and sustainable infrastructure, one that guarantees decent, low carbon work for all workers, including those in the fossil fuel industry. We call for an end to the hoarding of wealth by the same small percentage of Canadians who control the extractive industries that are causing ecological deterioration. And our demands for economic justice include a $15 minimum wage for all, the right to unionize, and higher taxation of the ultra-rich and corporations they control, whose greed has caused the climate crisis. Just a little bit about what a just transition means. So a just transition means that society shares the cost of transitioning to a low carbon economy. So it would be unjust for workers and communities in affected sectors to shoulder the full cost of the transition. So we actually need to have support across the board for anybody in these industries, because right now we do rely on them a lot, and we have to recognize that in order to transition in a way that supports those workers, we have to make sure that their transition is fully supported through funding. So in practice, just transition requires cooperation and collaboration among workers, unions, employees, communities, families, and all levels of government. Together, they actively identify and implement opportunities to develop skills, secure decent work, sustainably develop their communities, and enhance social protections. So there's a few principles that are needed for a just transition, and they're really important to ensure that all of them are incorporated. Most notably, the second point, worker participation at every stage of transition. So that's really important because as Fridays for Future, we understand that if a just transition is going to be effective at curbing emissions and just for workers, much of the framework that underlies the just transition has to come from political action, has to come from the workers themselves. So, and often it's coming from political action and mobilization from bottom-up consultation of the workers in order to create that framework that will actually support them instead of just imposing something on them that higher ups might think would work. So these are some important principles. That one is the most important, but to ensure that all of the other ones are also incorporated in the Just Transition Plan. So the next thing I want to talk about is an example of a just transition in Canada. So one example that we have right now is the transition for Canadian coal power workers. And this was published on December 2018. And it has been a good framework on which to build future attempts at a just transition in Canada, although we recognize that it's not to the scale that we do need immediately. So some outcomes of the project include the recognition that a just transition must become an integral part of climate action plans in Canada and internationally. So as the world transitions to a low carbon economy, we have to make sure that workers in high carbon industries are transitioned in a way that is just for them. Without incorporating a just transition, we risk increased polarization on the issue and eroding public support for action on climate change. It has also shown us that the government of Canada has a window of opportunity and the tools, authorities, and resources to adopt and implement these recommendations to demonstrate global leadership. So this example shows us that they do have the power and they do have the window of opportunity to implement these things in Canada now when we do need to begin transitioning. So I just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions, you can put an asterisk in the chat to ask it by voice, or if you just have a question, you can type it into the chat as well. So the next thing I want to just talk about is how labor organizing is essential to ensure we get climate justice. So right now, the working class is very divided about the response to climate change. And the reason why is that most workers see their jobs as dependent on increased production and linked to high carbon industries. So this is especially true of certain workers in the energy sector, auto sector, food sector, tech sector, and others. So we have to recognize that there is some disparities between the understanding of how the two are linked and how they can work together to get what they want. So workers in high carbon industries, if they adopt these ideas of a just transition and think that climate justice is an important component of their work, then both of the groups can move together and actually go towards the same goals. So this is really important to explain. So labor organizing, so solving the division between the working class and trade union movement depends on education of nature and the climate crisis and addressing two key issues. So the first is job loss and job creation. So it's often thought that workers will be out of a job if we transition to a green economy, but that's not necessarily true if we implement a just transition. When we'll be creating a lot of new jobs that don't exist right now, that would actually create way more jobs than we currently have in industries that are high carbon. So these include retrofitting, retrofitting all buildings, which would create so many jobs compared to people in the oil industry, for example. And then the other thing is maintaining income. So this is just, in order to transition, we have to make sure that there's the window of time between having your current job and moving into a green job, that those workers are still financially supported. So there's a few different ways that that can happen, and including salary when the workers aren't currently working, to transitioning them to moving them into a different job and paying them as they go. But I think that in order to define that better, it has to come from people who are currently doing research, such as the other example of the transition to coal, from coal industries that I talked about earlier. So we're just going to emphasize why this transition is very urgent. So in 2018, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a special report with collaborations among many different climate scientists who indicated that we only have 10 years to mitigate the impacts of global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius to prevent ecological collapse. So today, emissions are still rising, and we're slowly running out of time to act accordingly. So this transition is a really big step that we could take to decrease our global impact. In addition, the Paris Agreement in 2015 recognized the need for a just transition to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change and adhere to the boundaries of global average temperature rise. So the parties agreed that this is a really important component of the Paris Agreement and what all different countries need to do as a global collective in order to reach those targets that we are still not on track for. Okay, so the next thing we have to talk about is what a just transition will look like, because I think this is the biggest hurdle for a lot of workers to understand, and for a lot of citizens to understand as well, just in order to kind of bridge that gap and understand from here, how do we implement these changes? So some questions we should think about is, should we be taking climate crisis measures? If so, what would they look like? Should we pay workers until new jobs are created that meet the needs of the environmental crisis? So this is similar to COVID-19 measures, where a lot of workers are being paid even though they're not working, in order to bridge that time when they're out of work. Should we legislate mandatory reduced working hours with no loss of pay to increase employment without increasing production or consumption? So this is a question around how much can we extract from the world? Is there a finite limit? How can we ensure that our economy is neutral and doesn't have negative impacts by continued extraction? We want a circular economy. So less hours might be a good opportunity to provide people with more at-home leisure time, but also ensure that they have a good income. So there's a bunch of different ideas that we can think about when brainstorming about what a just transition will look like and different measures that we can implement. Okay, so striking and labor movement action. So I just want to go and remind everyone that rediscovery of the global climate strike comes from workers' struggle. Workers' movements such as the fight for workplace health and safety, women's rights, and BIPOC rights all came from below, from a few loud voices. So usually it was a few people pushing for something that a lot of others thought was never possible. And nowadays we take these different things as for something that's always existed. And so we have to acknowledge that there has been issues before that have achieved great things, and that by thinking it's impossible, it will influence our ability to mobilize. So we should always look to the past to see how these different groups have gained the collective power they needed to push these through and to improve working environments. So the difference with today's issue of climate change is that we're actually faced with a deadline of when we're able to do this in order to limit the impacts. So that 10-year mark was not in place for all of these other movements, but we can learn from them to understand how they did mobilize for those to gain those wins. So this movement is a little bit different as well, because it can work across all different silos from many different groups of people to create a collective power required to win within the time frame. So the crisis kind of overlaps with a bunch of different issues, and has the opportunity to mobilize many different people from many different sectors of the population. So increasingly, the labor movement will have looked at this type of action to bring about systems change, and it's already happening that a lot of labor folks are looking into different ways to build the climate movement and climate justice movement into their workplace. So one example of labor movement action was in Australia, where there was 56 unions that gave a public response to the fires. And this is really striking because it was all of these unions that came together and had a collective agreement that these fires were unprecedented and that they're a real issue that they needed to speak out on publicly. So they said a failure to act on the climate crisis constitutes an immediate threat to the health and safety of workers in Australia and around the world. As such, workers have the right to withdraw their labor until these threats are dealt with. In other words, workers should be ready to strike over the climate crisis. So this is a really positive outcome of the devastation that happened in Australia, recognizing that labor movements have really recognized their place in the climate justice movement and that they're willing to be an active participant. So the second example is with COVID-19. This is very present example right now. And it's how to maintain income for individuals who are out of a job. And there's a bunch of different campaigns going on right now online, understanding how workers are being affected by COVID-19. And one example is the COVID-19 We Need Help campaign with the Fight for 15 and Fairness, who are running a campaign to demand 21 paid emergency leave days, an immediate non-repayable emergency fund, greater access to employment insurance, and that no worker is left behind. So if you're interested in seeing a little bit more about that, you can find it on the 15 and Fairness webpage. There is many other campaigns that are happening as well to try to support workers and to ensure that people have the ability to take time off work so they don't spread the disease. And this is a very relevant example right now. So it's time to bring these issues to the labor movement in Canada and to working class organizations in the community. So the next thing we're just going to talk about is building community power. And this is really important to give people ideas of how they can be part of the transition to a green economy in labor, despite maybe not being in labor unions themselves. So if you are in a union or labor organization, there's a bunch of different resources that you can use to bring the conversation into your workplace and to mobilize fellow employees. So the first, so one really great link is laborcouncil.ca/climate, and they have resources including a climate justice motion and plan of engagement. So the climate justice motion is a comprehensive approach to becoming a leader in sustainability, and they have steps to follow in that document to kind of lay out how you can really have an impact in your workplace. The plan of engagement is a basic outline of how you can undertake work in your union to be part of the movement for green jobs, fighting for equity, and a just transition in a sustainable economy. The next resource is the Join the Labor Climate Justice Network. So this is a network of individuals who are part of labor unions and who are interested in being an active member in the climate justice movement within labor. And they have had a number of labor roundtables and climate caucuses. So these are a great way to connect with other like-minded union members and to brainstorm ways to build power within your workplace. So I had the opportunity to participate in 2 labor roundtables and a climate caucus at the Ontario Federation of Labor conference. And they were really great ways to understand how the issues that are coming up and the different ways of thinking about just transition, different hurdles that labor folks see in implementing a just transition within their workplace, and then just brainstorming on ways that they will be able to have the most impact. So it's great conversations and great ways of getting involved. So you can contact Skylar at smahαρaj@laborcouncil.ca. So I'll be posting these slides later. So if you want any of these resources, you can also look there afterwards. And then the last thing is create a joint environmental committee in your workplace. So this is a traditional way of starting discussions with other members of your union, with people who are like-minded, to try to get movement going on different issues within your workplace. Okay, so in the community, how to incorporate labor issues while building community. So how to integrate community and workers' issues, promoting worker/labor and community joint action. So we have a few examples of well thought out ideas for building action within your workplace and to create that power between locals and people in labor unions themselves. So this example is demanding locally produced and organic food and legislation governing grocery outlets, requiring safety of locally produced organic food and in composting of food waste. So measures which ensure support for local farmers and increase jobs in the grocery chain. So all of these 3 things are linked and support each other. The second example is requiring end-of-life return of products combined with new facilities to disassemble, reuse, and reclaim material, combined with local research and production facilities to develop use for the reclaimed material. So these measures reduce waste in the community and increase jobs and local sustainability. And the third example is subsidies for and regulations requiring low and energy reduction initiatives such as low energy appliances, renewable energy initiatives such as solar requirements for new buildings and retrofits, and regulations requiring local production of those products. So these measures ensure energy reduction, alternatives, and jobs. So these 3 examples are all of them kind of work together to help the community, help labor individuals, and build that action where everyone benefits from the interaction between labor and climate. So any other ideas? So we would love to hear your ideas by writing in the chat or speaking and typing a question, or writing an asterisk in the chat to speak, or typing the question into the chat. So these are some examples that we thought of, but there is endless examples that can be thought of that could be implemented in your community. Okay, so we have someone who would like to. David, you would like to speak?
Hi, thank you.
Hi.
One of your slides was titled Building Community Power, but I didn't see any reference. So the Canadian Union of Postal Workers has had an active campaign for some time called Building Community Power, which talks about transition, which you've been talking about, how to use the infrastructure that Canada Post has, which is massive across the country. There are more postal outlets than Tim Hortons, and that they could be used for everything from powering electric vehicles to becoming a community hub for all kinds of things. So I'm just wondering if you or anyone has any thoughts on that, if you know about it. Because you said you were at the Ontario Federation of Labor Convention. I'm guessing they would have had, the postal workers would have had some sort of booth there talking about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Brian, do you want to speak to that?
The thing is, I'm Brian Champ. I've been involved in helping organize some of the climate strike outreach in the past number of instances of the climate strike. And I know Angela from the postal workers was involved in September, and there has been involvement along the way by CUPW. But I think in the last while, that campaign hasn't been as actively linking up with our movement, but it's definitely something that we have worked with and would like to continue working with in the future. And one of the elements of that was the combination of the Green Jobs Oshawa campaign that is still working to nationalize the GM plant in Oshawa to produce green vehicles. And one of the ideas floated was around renewing the Canada Post fleet as part of that building community power. So that's definitely one of the campaigns that's still ongoing, and I think it's an important thing to be connected up to.
Just wanted to add something. David, thanks for bringing that up. I think that it's important to realize that as Fridays for Future is setting out to build connections with the labor movement, this is a beginning of trying to do some education around it. And we know there's a long way to go, but what is important is if we can build links through this conversation with the postal workers, with other organizations around what they're doing, and also to talk about what ways the labor movement as a whole can begin to take political action or stronger political action, in bringing this matter to a head. One of our major concerns is that there's so little time left. And this whole movement started as a response to that with Greta Thunberg, saying that we don't have time, we have to take action now. Students are striking, and they're bringing that message to the labor movement as well. How do we engage in that political movement? So it would be useful to have some ideas from you and others around how we can maintain contact with labor organizations like CUPW, how we can integrate what they're doing into what we're doing, and how we can work together in the future.
Thank you for the input, everyone. Yeah, I think I just want to say that like Fridays for Future is a youth organized movement, and our primary focus has been on mobilizing people to strike every Friday, to have a general youth presence out at Queen's Park. So yes, this, like Nick said, this is the beginning of Fridays for Future Toronto's connections with labor, and trying to establish those links and a bigger network to work within to connect those our mutual demands and our mutual goals. So yeah, this is definitely a start, and I have seen CUPW's Building Power booklet, and it's really, really amazing. All of the examples are so empowering, and really they seem reachable. So I think that's like a very positive aspect of CUPW's campaign. And I think that in building these links, we'll be able to support each other mutually through through our different communication webs, just because ours focuses more on youth, but to get youth understanding how labor is very involved is really important. So the last thing I just wanted to talk about is our upcoming actions that you can be part of. So Toronto is having our online global climate strike on April 3rd. And we chose the theme A Green New Deal, Green New Decade, which encompasses the diverse nature of our demands, including a just transition and a move to a green economy. And we recognize that this is very different from our normal strikes as it's online due to COVID, but we do hope that we have a pretty good showing. And we also have our last teach-in coming up on Thursday about Indigenous self-determination and COVID-19. So please tune into that. And then the last thing is just to check out our website for any more information. We have a lot of information about our stances on different issues, as well as photos and updates about our actions. Okay, I just want to ask everyone if there's any questions or anything else that people would like to talk about in a just transition. I think there's definitely a lot of things we can touch on. If anyone has any comments to some of the different things we talked on, we can go back through the presentation. But it was great to speak with you today. If anyone would like to speak out loud, you can use an asterisk. Otherwise, you can type your question into the chat.
So if no one else, okay, somebody's asked a question. Wait.
Amy. So Amy says, where do you go from here with motivating for a just transition? What are the next steps? So as an organizing group, we talked about this a little bit on Sunday on our weekly meetings. And we talked about what our April 3rd event actually stands for. And we've decided, because COVID-19 will take a while to resolve itself, that it's likely we'll be online for a while. So we're going to use it as our platform to kind of spearhead our own kind of campaign for a Green New Deal. And this will definitely include more concrete actions that people can take. But if you are part of a labor union, that slide that I had a little bit back. If you're not, you can also check out these resources as well. They have some good layout of different actions that people can take within their workplace. And even if you're not part of a labor union, it could apply to your own workplace as well. So these are some good resources to look at about like different steps that you can take as well. Brian, do you want to speak?
Yeah, and just in terms of the current moment we're in, I think one of the ways we can really make an impact right now, when we're stuck just being at home and our activism is a kind of an online version, is making those links concrete. So when there's workers struggling for an issue like just control over their own health and safety in their work environment, for example, then how can we as a climate movement, in terms of the current crisis of COVID, how can we as a climate movement show solidarity with the workers there and show that actually these struggles are linked together and build a big community of resistance, so that when we do come out from under this cloud, we can hit the ground running and really, but also in the meantime, we don't have to wait. We can put pressure, we can put political pressure, we can take workplace action, we can join rent strikes, we can do all these kinds of actions and so on.
And I just want to emphasize that it's evolving. Like our understanding of what to do is we're grappling with that because the situation is very different than it was. Another thing that's likely to happen is that there will be moves or policies from the government which could reinforce the carbon economy rather than the alternative that should emerge from the crisis we're in right now. And so how we address that will be a question in terms of how we organize, et cetera. And I think we're always, I think we need more input, and we're evolving our understanding of what to do, how to do it. So anything you have to add would be very helpful, of course.
So Sarah says, Iron and Earth was planning to have an oil and gas worker consultation this spring. Not sure what they're doing now due to COVID, but we need to be pressuring our MPs for publicly and financially support the work that they're doing. Thank you, Sarah. This is really good information. For April 3rd, we're actually drafting some asks that we can get people to do as follow-up actions to support some of our demands. So this is a really good resource for us to add to those asks as well. Amy has a point that she would like to add.
Hi, I just figured it might be easier to speak out loud. I was just going to say, yeah, it was interesting you're saying reaching out to different sectors. And I think especially with COVID right now, there's been a lot of news around construction workers. So potentially that's an area of connection because there's, a lot of calls around sort of health and safety concerns and distancing measures and how that's really, it's becoming a risky engagement for people that still have to go onto construction sites. And I think, provinces all across and territories are approaching it differently depending on where you are. I think my understanding is still allowing people to go to work and aren't mandating that they should stop. So that's kind of an interesting issue when you look at, how to sort of manage the labor transition, because it's something that fuels our economy in a big way. It's a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. It's sort of this really like hot button topic. Full disclosure, I'm a planner, not that I deal with land use planning. I'm a cultural planner, but it's something that housing and those sorts of pressures of growing population is something that we talk about quite a bit as planners. But yeah, so that might be something to connect with, because I think there's quite a bit going on in the construction industry right now, and potentially there's labor sort of movements that you can connect to that kind of need that support at this time.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just creating that network right now, so that's really helpful for me to look into different areas because I've just been kind of asking around. So this is really good. So thank you so much for giving that resource. We have Rosemary who would like to speak as well. Oops, sorry.
You keep muting me. There I go. So
Sorry
just in
about that.
terms of talking about the COVID and our recovery, and the point Nick made about the worry that they're just going to bail out these big industries and push us towards a more carbon society or whatever, as a way to try to financially fix the problem. There's a whole group, a group of organizations, including 350, and Naomi Klein talks about us talking about a just recovery now. It's basically the just transition, but in light of what's going to have to happen for us to rebound from the COVID pandemic and the financial fallout that has occurred, it's very much like the just transition. But so they have 5 principles, and I suggest you all take a look at it. Just recovery, just Google it, you'll find it.
Thank you, Rosemary. Yeah, that sounds, I like the language used there. Just recovery has a good kind of visual to it when dealing with COVID right now. Does anyone else have any questions before we wrap up? Or any comments? Ben, yes.
Hi, I would like to suggest as one of our demands, I thought that democratization of the economy could be part of that. Because we have things about climate justice, and a big part of labor and climate is the system. And so I think that would be a good idea.
Okay. So we do have one that is kind of similar. I think it would be the universal public service and infrastructure. So that one's a little bit similar just because it's looking at publicly funded services for all. So I think that idea is kind of encompassed already, but I see where you're coming from for a bit more clarity in the language. Okay. Okay, so I will just wrap this up. Thank you all for tuning in today. It's been great to speak to you about labor and climate, especially since I've been doing a lot of work for it on the ground, but now online. And I hope you had a good experience. I'll be posting the slides onto the event page and onto our website soon. As well as the recording. So please keep an eye out, and I hope you all are able to tune in on April 3rd. Thank you.